absolute honor to be here. Thank you all so much for taking some time out of your day to join us here for this. And thank you so much for completing the survey. I really tried to make sure that I addressed the top 3 that came through in the survey in terms of topics and try to interweave all that into today's presentation. This is the culmination of our survey. We called it Choose Your Own EDI Adventure. So our adventure today is going to be achieving cultural competence and cultural humility through an understanding of workplace privilege and bias and the application of EDI assessment practices. I am Dr. Kawanna Bright. I am currently an assistant professor of library science in beautiful Greenville, North Carolina at East Carolina University. So I always do like to start with a land and people acknowledgement. So I want to acknowledge the Tuscarora people, who are the traditional custodians of the land on which I work and live, and recognize their continuing connection to the land, water, and air that Greenville consumes. I pay respect to 8 recognized tribes: the Kohari, Eastern Band of Cherokee, Haliwa Saponi, Lumbee, Meherrin, Okanichi Banasaponi, Saponi, and Wakamasuan, all nations and their elders past, present, and emerging. I also want to acknowledge the enslaved peoples who worked and died on these lands and their descendants. Their pain and struggle made it possible for me to be with you today. I am their legacy. So for today's session objectives, we are going to make sure we understand the concepts of cultural competence, cultural humility, and how they impact library work. I'm going to introduce the cultural competence continuum because, at least for me, it's an easy way to think about how to gain those skills that we're looking for when we talk about cultural competence, and also the actions that you can actually take in the library to move up the continuum. Try to recognize issues with privilege and bias in libraries and how to combat those issues, and then identifying areas where applying EDI assessment practices can actually improve cultural competence efforts and provide libraries with concrete knowledge about their EDI efforts. And what I've done throughout the presentation is sort of interwoven those aspects of privilege, bias, and also the EDI assessment within moving through the continuum. All right, so we have to start, of course, with the definition of cultural competence, and you're going to see a variety of definitions out there. This is not a library term or topic, at least not in the beginning. We have made it something that we refer to a lot, but of course it didn't start in libraries. Usually you see a lot of this coming out of human resources, but also social work, psychology, and of course the business world. I like to pull these 3 definitions because I think combined they give you this really clear picture of what we mean by cultural competence. So starting with Hansen et al., we're talking about this understanding and awareness of the different aspects of human identity and the impact that understanding that those identities have on understanding human behavior and our ability to ethically and successfully work with culturally diverse communities. Now, Chow starts reminding us about this idea of that it's not just about functioning in your own culture, because you do actually have to learn how to function in your own culture, but also the ability to successfully interact with those from cultures outside of and very different from your own cultures. And then also from Wilson et al., we get this idea of the acquisition and maintenance of culture-specific skills. And this is actually really important for cultural competence because of the aspect of needing to gain cultural competence, something you're going to learn, and then maintain it. If you don't practice it, you do start to lose it. And really being able to, once again, function effectively within a new cultural context or interact effectively with people from different cultural backgrounds. Now, as I mentioned, this is not new to libraries. We've seen this addressed in different types of libraries. ACRL back in 2012 actually started talking a little bit more about this when they released their diversity standards. And so from their definition, which they actually pulled from the social workers, they said, we're going to the social workers because they do this work. But the emphasis here, of course, is on this idea of having this congruent set of behaviors and attitudes and policies that actually enable a person or group. And so this is the reminder that you can do this work individually, but also as an organization. You need to be culturally competent. And then also this idea of responding respectfully and effectively to people from all cultures and languages and classes and races, all those identities we talk about. And then also this idea that you're doing it in a way that's going to recognize, affirm, and value the worth of those individuals, the families, the communities. And so I think this fits really well with libraries. So what ACRL really tried to do was give this set of 11 standards related to diversity and how cultural competency might be applied, at least in academic libraries. I'll be honest and say I'm not sure how many people ever really looked at this list and tried to apply it, but it's there. It's something you can look at. I don't think it's necessarily it clearly tells you how to do the work, but it's something to think about. And so the idea here from them was to focus on cultural awareness of self and others, which is really important for cultural competence, the awareness of self, the idea of looking inward and being self-reflective, and then the cross-cultural knowledge, being able to learn about other cultures and gain some skills in doing that work as well, looking at organizational and professional values, We have to think about developing our collections, our programs, and our services, and how we deliver our services. But we also think about language diversity, including this idea of preservation of language. How do we play a part in doing that in libraries? And of course, the age old issue of our workplace diversity that we have in libraries, looking specifically at issues with organizational dynamics. And that can be based on identities, but it can also be based on status. So, this idea that we often have hierarchies in our organizations that cause problems. And then this idea of cross cultural leadership, making sure you're having gaining professional education, continuous learning, and then applying that through research and also being mindful of being culturally competent in your research as well. So, as I mentioned, I prefer to look at this from the cultural competence continuum just because, in my mind, it's easier to think about how can I improve and what do I need to learn. And so, there are different variations of this continuum. You can do a quick Google search and see different visual variations of it. I like to think about it from the perspective of what good shares. And good gives us, I think, a nice way of just talking about what fits into these different areas. And so, there are six aspects to the cultural competence continuum. If you're far to the left, then you're on the negative side of the continuum. If you're far to the right, you're on the positive side of the continuum. So all the way down to cultural destructiveness and then all the way up to cultural proficiency. And it often surprises people that cultural competence isn't the final one. And what Good and others are saying is that cultural competence, of course, is important. You're going to reach that. That's why it's called the cultural competence continuum. But there is a level higher than that. There is a level of being even more than just competent, but being proficient. And so we're going to spend most of our time talking through probably the last five of this. Reason I don't spend a lot of time on cultural destructiveness is because it is the lowest level on the continuum and also probably the most negative level. We don't often see organizations, even libraries, that are at this level. And that's the level where you have attitudes, policies, structures, and practices that are completely destructive to a cultural group. Now, am I saying that libraries that exist now don't have this problem? No, not saying that. What I'm saying is I haven't had that experience yet. And if you are at that lowest level, then there's definitely a lot of work that needs to be done, including dismantling the entire organization. But we're going to spend a little bit more time talking about cultural incapacity, cultural blindness, and then getting into the cultural sensitivity range, competence, and proficiency. So starting with cultural incapacity, this is where we have a lack of capacity within our organization, but also within ourselves to respond effectively to the needs, the interests, and the preferences of culturally and linguistically diverse groups. And what we see when we have an organization or even people who are in cultural incapacity is institutional bias. We have discriminatory hiring and promotion practices. We have disproportionate allocation of resources. We have a devaluing of some cultural groups within the organization, and then also reduced expectations for those groups. And so this idea that they're not allowed to do certain things or not invited to do certain things as well. And this is also where we start seeing issues with bias. This is like the whole area of why do we have issues with bias in our organizations? If bias is a main concern, especially this idea of where privilege fits as well, then you're probably looking at an organization or an individual who's dealing with this incapacity level. So when we talk about bias, let's make one thing clear. Typically, there are two types of bias we talk about: implicit, explicit. Yes, you can look at bias in different ways. This is just the way I happen to introduce and look at bias. Implicit bias is when our views about people are unconsciously impacted by attitudes or stereotypes. In essence, we don't necessarily recognize that we have a bias against something, but we make decisions or do things based on these unconscious ideas or attitudes or stereotypes. Even if our intentions, when we go into a process of hiring or promotion or even just interacting with people, is to be fair, implicit bias means that you could unintentionally be biased without really actually recognizing that. And typically, other people will see it, but you won't necessarily see it, and they may have to call you on it as well. Now, explicit bias is what people typically think of when we say someone's biased. And this is when you're very much aware that you have an attitude or a prejudice about a different type of person or a group or pretty much just about anything. And it can actually be negative or positive. And I have to make sure I clarify this. I don't mean negative, positive as in good or bad. It's a good thing to have explicit bias. What I mean is that you can have a positive bias towards something. You can have a preference for something, and you can pretty much tend to express that preference where people recognize it. But you can also, of course, have a negative bias and express that negative bias and make sure people are very clear about that bias that you may have. But implicit bias can also be negative or positive. So when we think about our organizations, we start also thinking about where does this bias affect us? And also, what does privilege have to do with this as well? And so when you have some people in your organization who actually have more opportunities, more power, more benefits, more advantages based on something about themselves, usually their identities, Those privileges also happen to be unacknowledged by those who happen to be privileged, or at least they're not going to tell you that they recognize they have them. And then also we continue to perpetuate them, right? They get repeated. Then you have a major issue with organizational privilege and bias. And that's exactly what many of us have probably experienced this working in an organization. I like to pull this tweet from Dr. Monica Cox, who actually doesn't work in LIS, if I'm not mistaken, engineering education at the Ohio State University, at least that's where they were. But I just thought this tweet really helped sum up something I was thinking about as well. I was actually doing a different presentation on bias. And what Dr. Monica Cox says is that this is how you know who's valued in your organization, whose stories are believed, whose complaints are responded to, who's paid the highest salaries, who's given multiple chances, whose bad behaviors are not addressed, and who benefits from organizational policies. And what Dr. Cox has pretty much encapsulated here is institutional bias and privilege, just by asking these questions. And the responses to these questions, which usually help us to clearly see that something's going wrong in our organization. Now, if we think about where this is going to manifest in libraries, so where are we seeing this privilege and bias in library organizations? Well, we definitely see it in our hiring practices. We also see it in promotion practices, resource allocation, but also disciplinary actions. Who is disciplined, who is not disciplined? Even in our collection development, our processes, our policies, what we choose to add to our collections, and definitely in our policy development and our implementation of our policies. We always need to stop and have the conversation of who and how. And what I mean by this is that who's involved in the hiring practices, who's involved in promotion practices, who's not involved, who's left out, but also how are we going about it? How do we hire? How do we promote? How do we decide who gets resources? And it's within those questions, the answers to those questions, that we often recognize immediately that there's probably going to be a problem, right? There may be one or two people with a little bit too much pull, a little bit too much say. And if there's concerns about your organization, especially your library, going in a certain direction, always hiring the same types of people, never hiring other types of people for whatever various identities they may have, you typically find it because there's one or two people who have the privilege and have the power in the organization and are the ones who are always involved in those processes. Now, when we start thinking about what it really looks like when you have something like unconscious bias and how it's going to manifest itself in the organization, you typically see two things. You have the affinity bias or the confirmation bias. And affinity bias is basically the like me bias, and it just means you tend to respond more positively to someone or something that's very similar to us. And this is something that's actually just a normal human reaction to things. We tend to respond more positively to things that are just very familiar, right? This is something that's familiar to me. What we often see, of course, in the workplace and in hiring is that you'll have people who will hire people who look like them, sound like them, have similar backgrounds as them, because they're more comfortable with that. And they also tend to have this belief that that means that that grouping is more superior, right? If this person's like me and I'm here, then this person's really good for our organization. Confirmation bias, of course, is this idea that you're going to notice only the evidence that helps support whatever your beliefs are, and you're going to ignore anything that actually doesn't align with this. Anyone who's ever done information literacy instruction or reference work and had someone come up to you and say, I've written my paper already, but I now need you to help me find the articles that will help support what I've written, know that you're dealing with someone who's going to have some major confirmation bias issues, right? They're only looking for things that align with the information that they already have. This, of course, is problematic, especially if you think about when someone's being disciplined. And let's just say that you've had someone who's been a bit of a troublemaker in your organization. They've kind of always been known to be the person causing the problems. And there's a situation where they're accused of doing something, right? Typically, you're going to see that as confirmation of that bad behavior no matter what that person does, right? That person may not have been involved, they may have not have been the instigator, but because of maybe always only seeing what you expect to see from that person, confirmation bias may step in, and you may see yourself siding with other people against that person, saying that of course this person started the fight, or of course this person's not doing what they're supposed to be doing. It's what they always do. So it's really important that we actually recognize that these two types of biases do show up in us individually and also within our workplace. And why it's important, of course, is as Perez says here, if we are only hiring, promoting, training, mentoring, or valuing those who are like us, then we become organizations that are made of clones. Basically, we become organizations that can't be innovative, can't solve problems, can't do the things that we need to do to be successful and forward moving, that we become the same insular organization that we've always been. And we make the same mistakes and we have the same problems. And then when everything comes crashing down, we have no one to blame but ourselves because we continue to perpetuate all the issues that we actually had. So if we're thinking about how do we start combating these things, right? So how do we actually try to offset bias in the work we do? Well, broadly, I can tell you that we need to make sure we're taking a step back and reviewing our processes and our policies and asking those questions about the who's and the whys. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about reviewing policies and really the amount of detail you usually have to do to get into a policy review to identify bias and remove it from your policies. But there's also this need for a lot of self-reflection because there are a lot of people who do not want to admit that they have biases. I will be the first one to stand up here and tell you that I have biases and I recognize those biases and I have to work on them every day. And I make sure that they do not influence how I make decisions about other people or even my own life, right? But that's hard work, right? That's that level of self-reflection that oftentimes we don't have time for or we don't want to get into, but it's very much necessary to truly understand how these things might be influencing the work that we do and also how much we might be negatively impacting others as well. The other thing is building in accountability into all our actions, into all our processes, because if you have accountability, basically you have someone who's going to call you on some of your behaviors or call others on those behaviors and hopefully keep them from perpetuating themselves in the organization. Now, if we take a closer look, hiring practices, perfect place to look for bias and to think about how we can combat it. And one of the first things that I always tell anyone is that every person who goes into a search, if they're on the committee or they're making the decision, need to have completed intentional bias training and need to complete that training pretty much every year as a reminder that these are the things you're looking for within yourself and things you want to be aware of to make sure you're not taking that into the hiring process. But you also want to go through your application review process and try to identify some bias trouble spots. Are there things where you see certain candidates, usually from underrepresented backgrounds, not making it past a certain level in your application review process? Review the process, try to figure out where that snag is and figure out if it's a bias snag or if something else is going on in the organization. Also, and you've probably all seen this or heard this, you should have a rubric when you're actually rating your applicants and looking at qualifications. But notice I called it an objective rubric because I have seen some very subjectively built rubrics that I'm not sure how they pass muster at some organizations, but the rubric is so biased itself that you're going to see certain candidates excel and other candidates not excel. And so it's the idea of building an objective rubric that's only focused on the qualifications for the position and how the person aligns with those qualifications. I also encourage people to eliminate the use of the term fit when they're trying to determine whether somebody is suitable for a position. And I'm not saying that fit's not important because there is this idea of people fitting into the position and fitting even within an organization, but oftentimes fit is taken a little too far and it's focused more on personal identities. So I was actually told once that reason I wasn't invited back for an interview was because they were worried I wouldn't fit into the city. They were worried I wouldn't be able to find things to do in the city that appealed to me based on their stereotypes of what they thought I was interested in, which apparently turned out to be jazz music and also I think it was basketball. Those were the two things they were concerned about. I wouldn't be able to find enough jazz music and enough basketball to watch. Needless to say, neither of those things was a concern for me, but that didn't seem to matter for that group. And those types of things, if people are thinking that way and making decisions about who they even invite for an interview process, then you can already see where this is a bias or a stereotypical barrier that shows up. We also want to make sure we're focusing on what people say, not how they say it. And this kind of goes both ways. Now, what Coach Iari was really probably talking about is the situation where you have someone who maybe has an accent, a very thick accent. I have a colleague whose native language was Spanish, speaks English fluently, but speaks it with an accent. And I've seen the number of people who have treated this colleague as if they don't have a PhD, as if they're not an intelligent person, just because they think their accent is difficult to understand. I don't have any trouble understanding this person. Most people do not, but it becomes a barrier because immediately some people's ears just tune out and they say, I can't understand this person. Or if someone just doesn't use proper grammar all the time, and that includes in their writing communication. We have a habit of judging people on their ability to write things in a grammatically correct way. It's the teacher in me, of course, that does that. And I have to remind myself that, can I actually see what my student meant? Yes. Then why am I worried about how bad the grammar was? We can work on the grammar, right? Let's move on from that. But there have been a number of times where people's applications have not made it past the next level because of that. The content wasn't important to these people, it was how it was said. Also, if possible, and this is not done in a lot of places because usually don't have enough people to do this anyway, or it's just not part of the structure. But most of these processes need some type of external reviewer, someone who is actually just paying attention to the process, paying attention to the overall pool that's being recruited, paying attention to the final candidates that are being brought in, and making sure that they're keeping an eye out for potential issues with bias within the process and stopping the process if they actually see problems in the process. Once again, this can be very difficult. I've served in this capacity, but only as a person who's already on the committee, not someone who is external to the committee. And it was necessary in those cases for to have a voice saying, but wait a minute, like the conversation's going off the rails. We're talking about fit. We're talking about things that have nothing to do with the position. But if you don't have someone on the committee who's prepared to do that, having an external person there to help with that would be ideal. Doesn't happen a lot, but definitely would be ideal. Now, the other side of this, of course, when we're thinking about hiring is our interview practices. And this is another stumbling block we often have when we're trying to hire and definitely hire in a way that we're honoring all the different backgrounds and knowledge and information that people can bring to our organization. One thing I always warn people is make sure you're asking your candidates the same exact questions in the same order if possible. Yes, there will be follow-up questions that you can ask. Yes, sometimes a candidate will answer a question out of order just because they happen to answer it and you can move on to the next question. But moving questions around in a way to maybe overly focus on certain questions for some candidates and not for others means that you're probably automatically creating a biased view of that candidate. The other thing to do is make sure you are scoring the responses right away. I am the type of person that when I grade my students' papers, I will grade the paper, immediately put a grade on it, and then I actually have to go back through them to make sure I've been fair in the grading process. A lot of times with candidates, you'll see people though who will wait to see 2 or 3 candidates and then go back through and actually start scoring. And what we have to think about is a psychological thing here. You're either going to remember the best candidate more than anyone else, and that's going to be problematic when you're actually trying to score people fairly on how they did, or you're going to remember the last candidate because they're the most fresh in your mind, or maybe you're going to remember just the first candidate because it's the first one you saw. So as much as you can, going through and marking down your thoughts, the scores, using that rubric, the minute you're introduced to someone, you interview them, doing it right away is probably more beneficial to the candidate and also to the committee than anything else you can do. The other thing to do is make sure you're not asking biased interview questions. And I don't necessarily mean those illegal questions you cannot ask ever during an interview. Everyone's seen the list. Don't ask this, don't ask that. But there are questions that can be created or crafted by a search committee with an ideal candidate in mind, knowing that that ideal candidate is probably going to excel on that question and that other candidates might struggle a little bit on that question. Can happen, it does happen, and you want to be really careful about that. The questions you ask should be relevant to the position. And if some excel and some don't excel in answering that question, it needs to be based on the fact that they just didn't happen to have the skill set or the ability to respond, not because you structured the question knowing that some people were going to do better than others on that question. The other thing is making sure all your candidates have the same opportunities to interact with all library employees. This is not just for the faculty of color or librarians of color or candidates of color who are coming in and making sure they meet other diverse people. It's making sure that everyone has the same opportunity to interact with people who are coming into the organization and also the same opportunity to then give feedback on people who are coming into the organization. And then finally, because in libraries, and we've seen this happen, we do tend to promote internally a lot. And sometimes internal candidates have to apply, just like external candidates. Make sure that you're giving an equal experience for both. So you should not be shortening the interview process for someone who's internal. If you have a long day for external, you have a long day for internal. Same questions you ask internal, ask external. You're not adding questions to the internal just because you happen to know the person and happen to know their skill set. You're not taking away questions to the external because it doesn't apply to them because you actually know about the internal person. You want to make sure you have the same experience for everyone who's coming through that process. Now, I mentioned I was going to talk a little bit more about policy, so this is like the second slide on this. There's going to be a third one. It's a reminder, though, that both our internal and external policies can actually be discriminatory and biased in nature, and they're very much written that way. Internal policies, especially if they're outdated and have not been looked at in, say 5, 10 years, tend to include what I call legacy behaviors and processes that are really beneficial towards certain groups or certain people or certain employees who may or may not even be in the organization anymore. But are still in place and still being followed and may be detrimental to other people in the organization. So you definitely want to take some time to review the who, the what, the when, and the why of your policies and make sure that you're paying attention to what goes into that. As I mentioned, I'm going to show you a little bit more about that because that's an assessment piece, right? It's really trying to assess the policies and how do I take a closer look at that. Now, the promotion practices is also another area where we have stumbling blocks and we struggle. So, definitely making sure that everyone who's going to be going up for promotion of any particular type has equal access to that information. Like, how do I get promoted? It should be a standardized process. And if it is not a standardized process, it needs to be standardized and it needs to be written down. And it needs to, of course, align with your organization or your institution as well. But everyone should be hearing the same messages about the standards and the expectations. And also, everyone should be getting the same level of support and mentorship about the process. So there shouldn't be this problem of certain people getting more mentorship, more support, and other people not getting any support or any mentorship about how to be promoted within your organization. You also want to make sure you analyze the promotion eligibility and base it on the evidence of what you see in front of you, the evidence of their record, the evidence of what's presented to you, and not on your feelings about the person or your preferences for someone or their likability, because those are things that should not, in general, be included in whether someone's actually promoted based on their job skills and their experiences. And then, if allowed, once again, this idea of having external reviewers. Now, in academia, we get that a lot, right? External reviewers are usually called in to review a package. They don't usually know the person. It doesn't always happen in other types of libraries. But this idea that having someone who doesn't know the person and only has the record in front of them and the standards that the person is supposed to meet, and being able to have that person vote as well, and maybe even add that additional voice to the process is really important to help remove bias or at least pinpoint and identify that bias. Now, the last thing I want to talk about in this particular section is this idea of trying to build leadership and decision-making accountability. So I was a former middle manager. I've met other leaders in the same positions, and those positions can actually be very isolating in some cases, and you feel a little bit closed off. Often you're the only one. It's harder to make friends in the organization because you really can't because you're a supervisor. But that also means that you often start feeling like you have to make all the decisions yourself. And like, okay, I'm in charge. I got to figure this out because I'm going to be responsible for this. But there needs to be a checks and balance system, even for leaders, right? Top leaders, mid leaders, doesn't matter. There needs to be a checks and balance system. I usually suggest some type of advisory team, a team that you're willing to listen to, able to listen to, who can bring their experience, their information as well, but also just being open to discussion and even voting in some cases to help with the decision-making process and saying, okay, I want to hear some thoughts on this and how are we feeling about moving forward on this next process. And then also making sure that if you are making a decision and you're asking other people, that you're not just relying on one other person's voice or their story or their experience when making that decision, because your decision is probably going to affect the rest of the organization as well. And you need to make sure that everyone has the same opportunity to have a say in how you're going to move forward with something that's going to affect how they do their work, maybe even affect their lives. All right, so after all that talking, I did want to take just a quick break to ask you to participate in a poll with me. So hopefully this won't take us too long. But if you go to slido.com and the code is just Metro, and let me know which of the following can you actually say yes to. So I've experienced bias in the hiring process. I've experienced bias in the promotion process. I have been impacted by bias in my library's practices. And we'll see. I'm seeing some 50% votes here going up. Not as many who feel like they've been impacted, but definitely experienced the bias in the hiring and the promotion process. We'll give this just a couple more seconds. All right, so yeah, have experienced bias in the promotion process, have experienced bias in the hiring process, right around the 43, 45%, and have been impacted by bias, 35%. I'm not surprised by this. These numbers are never pretty. I would love to see this at like 10, less than 10%, right? Wouldn't that be great? But we definitely know these do exist. All right, so let's move forward because we're going to talk a little bit about cultural blindness because this is another area where we do tend to struggle in libraries. And when we talk about cultural blindness, this is where we tend to view everyone as the same. Like, oh, everything's the same. You had the same opportunities as me. You should have done the same things that I actually did. This usually means that in libraries, we tend to encourage assimilation. We ignore cultural strengths of people. We blame the users, in this case, our patrons and our communities, for their circumstances. We tend to not value cultural competence training. Our workforce tends to be very non-diverse in this point, and we don't have any resources or structure to support cultural competence. And this usually means that we have a problem with our organizational culture. And so I'm not going to read through all these definitions, but it's just a reminder that just as we have cultures that we fit into, our organizations are a culture. And oftentimes these are the behaviors or how you're expected to function in the workplace. So there's usually a lot of assumptions built into that as well. This idea of shared beliefs, shared languages, shared systems, this idea of patterns and how you actually structure the work of the organization. And can also mean problems that occur in the workplace as well. But what this means is that anyone new coming into the organization has to learn about the culture, right? And the trouble with organizational culture, as Maggie Farrell pointed out in their article, is that it's often rooted in the past, which means that if you're trying to change something, that's going to be pretty hard. People are not interested in you changing anything. They're very comfortable with the way things actually are, especially if they've been in place for a long time and are benefiting certain people and they're happy with the benefit. Now, Farrell actually says that organizational culture is neither good nor bad. It's simply how things are done. And I actually argue against that. I disagree with that because, as Alabi pointed out from their study on microaggressions in 2018, you can actually kind of build a racist bias structure into your organizational culture, which means that in that case, I find that to be a bad organizational culture, right? And so what this looks like for especially those coming into the organization, especially those who are from underrepresented, minoritized, traditionally underrepresented backgrounds, is that you have this sense of forced assimilation and organizational culture. So you have to ask yourself how your new employees learn about the culture of the organization, who tells them, who has the ability to tell them, who should be telling them that, and then what happens if it is a negative, discriminatory, or biased organizational culture. What do you tell that person who's going to be hit the most by that bias? Don't worry about it. This is how you work around it. And then what changes does that new employee have to make to fit in, right? Like, what are they going to have to change about themselves? And is it something they can even change about themselves to actually fit into the organization? Because there are some things we can't change, like the color of our skin. If the organization doesn't appreciate that part about us, what are we supposed to do to fit into the culture, right? So if we focus specifically on this idea of racial climate in our cultures, the racial climate of an organization is often seen as being very different for white versus BIPOC librarians. And so this once again comes from a lobby who did a lot of work on microaggressions and also how to create organizations that weren't focused on bias, right? How to be a better organization. And so what it looks like for those who are BIPOC is being ignored, snubbed, patronized, dealing with microaggressions, or even being avoided in the workplace, being isolated, being held to a different standard, being expected to do more, even though it doesn't really matter how much you do, you feel like it's never going to be good enough, having fewer opportunities, especially for leadership, being given diversity responsibilities, even though that's maybe not your background or what you want to do, being challenged all the time, being not credible or seen as not credible, being invalidated, being dismissed, being seen as too sensitive if you actually try to speak up, and then also feeling emotionally and physically exhausted throughout this process. And so, of course, this means there's a real retention issue, especially for BIPOC librarians, because of these experiences. And so, to many BIPOC librarians, the work culture, the organizational culture is actually very hostile. And why would you want to continue working there if it's a hostile environment, right? So if we're going to change this, we need to make sure we're working on educating ourselves and becoming aware, listening, especially to BIPOC librarians and those who also have diverse backgrounds who aren't being listened to often in the organization. Shifting away from color blindness, we are not all the same. Our backgrounds are very different. We go through very different things to get to where we're trying to get, and we need to make sure we recognize that. Recognizing that racism in the organization affects everyone. Also, that we look at our own motivations. If you're trying to be an ally for social justice, make sure you're being an ally and not just doing it because you're trying to be performative in that process. Make sure that we're very much aware of our interpersonal interactions, how we treat others and how we are treated by others. And make sure we're not invalidating the experience, especially of BIPOC librarians. And if you hear a microaggression, that you're speaking up and pushing back against those microaggressions. And then avoid the workshop mandates. So you've come to this session with Dr. Bright, you now know everything about this cultural competence thing and moving up the continuum. That's your band-aid, right? No, it's continuous learning. It's a continuous process, and we're always engaged in it. All right, so we also now have to look at the idea of reaching cultural sensitivity. We're here, right? We're getting better. So we're aware of our strengths and we're doing good work. So we value our high quality services. We have a commitment to human civil rights, hiring diverse workforces. We're conducting some assessments, improving our service delivery. We may still have some trouble with token representation, and we may not have a clear plan for how to actually achieve our cultural competence, but we've made some improvements. So if we're focusing on assessment at this point, because this is where we're really thinking about, can we count and can we understand what's happening? We do actually need to move beyond counting. That's one of the things we struggle with in libraries. We love to count things, but if you're trying to count people, it's problematic. You do have to do some counting. You need baselines. You need to have an understanding of how many of certain types of people and groups you have in your organizations. But this is a limited story. And so to get the full story, we need to focus on quantitative and qualitative data and make sure that we are doing the analysis necessary to understand that full story. I also tell people, if you do not have an EDI data plan, then you're going to be putting yourself into a really tough position when you start talking about EDI in your organization. If you don't have a data plan in general, that's a problem. So create a data plan for your library. But if you want to focus on EDI as well, make sure that's included in your data plan. And always focus on creating action plans, because action plans means you have goals, outcomes, activities, and that you have something to work towards. And it's not just conversation that's actually happening. And definitely, if you have not done so, do a climate assessment of your organization. You need to identify what the dominant culture is. You need to identify any specific issues that you're having, especially for employees who may be coming from different backgrounds. And it's going to help you to better understand the barriers and the issues, especially marginalized and historically underrepresented employees may be facing. And so that climate assessment is essential, and it needs to be repeated usually every 1-2 years to make sure that you can see where changes are being made. If you're talking about your departments, you want to actually review your work to make sure you identify where your EDI practices could and should fit in the work. Have that conversation within your departments with your colleagues to actually identify what you're already doing and start celebrating some of that work as well, and to see what barriers you actually have to integrating EDI into your work. So I do want you to take a moment to reflect on this just for one of those couple minute things. What barriers to integrating EDI into your work do you currently feel you face? And this is going to be a quick turnaround. I'm asking you for like that quick boom moment in your mind of what's the one barrier I feel like I actually have. So same place, slido.com, same code, Metro. And this was a little bit tougher, and you have to sometimes think about it. But what are some of the barriers that you actually might be facing or dealing with in terms of integrating EDI into your work? Oh, not a decision maker. Resistant leadership, that's a huge barrier. Doesn't have that data plan. Yep, I'll teach you what a data plan is. Don't worry, we'll get that one day. Not knowing what you don't know, being worried about messing up, lack of support. New employee in a large white machine. I'm saying a lot about leadership, and this is definitely something that is probably for most of you the largest issue that you have. If your leadership is not on board, you're swimming upstream the entire time. Makes it very difficult as well. Yeah. Unresponsive to change. Yeah, I think we can probably all figure out now where your organization is on that continuum, right? Yep. Lots of talk, no actions. And yeah, I think we should just go ahead and end with that last one, burnt out. And I think that's going to work for most people. And I know we're running out of time, so I do want to move forward, but thank you so much for this. It's always nice when people see this and you see one, you're not alone, and that these issues are almost universal as well. All right, so I do want to remind people that we do want to make sure we're avoiding tokenism and racial capitalism in our work, and this happens within this stage. So of course, tokenism is that practice of doing something, usually hiring someone, only to prevent criticism, to make sure that you're showing people, look at us, we're being diverse, right? We're being equitable, we're being fair. Racial capitalism is where you actually get some sort of social or economic value from the racial identity of another person. And these are two things that we struggle with in libraries, and two things we definitely need to continue working on avoiding. And to make sure that we're not doing this, here's some do's and don'ts. First of all, please do not create a false image of your workplace diversity. That includes using stock photos or using photos of people who no longer work in your organization to show other people how diverse you actually are. Do make sure we're working towards creating a workplace that is truly reflective of EDI, that it shows the actions and the things we're actually working on. Do work towards diversifying all your staffing levels through fair and equitable hiring practices, and then also create an organization that supports retention, because that's how you're going to make sure you have people when you need those photos, and everyone should be happy to be in there because they're part of this organization that loves them, and not just people who've left your organization in the past. All right, so we've made it to the cultural competence stage. We're able to exemplify cultural competence, demonstrating the work that we actually do. And so this means we see this in our mission statements and our policies and our practices, that we're including our community in the process, that we're implementing policies to develop a culturally competent workforce, that we support cultural competence, and that we have reciprocal community engagement. And so for integrating EDI into your statements and policies, it's just a reminder that we do need to review all our public statements, and this is how people see us, all our policies and all our processes. Be aware of using overly broad terms. So using the term diverse or diversity does not always kind of convey what we really mean by that. Having a separate EDI statement is really important, and also integrating that into our mission statement as well. And then having some EDI goals and objectives and having an EDI action plan are going to help you with trying to show this full integration. You're going to have some work to do, and this is the work we're going to do. This is how we're going to do it. And I mentioned I was going to show you what it would look like if you wanted to conduct an EDI policy review. Here are the questions you have to ask. And yes, these slides are going to be available, and I'm happy to also share more information on this for anyone who wants to reach out and contact me. But these are the questions you have to ask yourself, including who was the policy written for and who was it written by? Why was it written? What was the intent or purpose? Do you still even need the policy? When was it first created? When has it been updated? Have you even reviewed it in the last few years? Where is it applied? Is it applied evenly? Also, why was it created? And then how is it created? Was it done democratically, or did someone just kind of throw it together because it was in response to something that was happening in the library? As you answer these questions, you typically find out the answer that for most of these is we don't know. And that's problematic when you talk about policies that are used to basically control the behavior of certain groups of people who try to use our libraries. We see a lot of policies directed directly at those who are experiencing homelessness or sometimes teens, young users, and those policies were written specifically to control behavior of certain groups who are seen as problematic and not written for the purpose of making sure that your library is running efficiently and effectively the way it should be. Also, this idea of community and participatory engagement. So this includes assessment, outreach, your planning, your evaluation of your work. The goal is to introduce the voice of your user, to recognize that your users have important things to share with you, have a lot of knowledge, a lot of experiences as well. So using processes that are more inclusive, more collaborative in nature, also more democratic and transformative in nature can really help you to better understand the cultures of those communities and also integrate that into your work. For anyone who's planning on coming in October to the sessions on evaluation assessment, I'll be talking very specifically about community and participatory engagement and what that actually looks like and what some of the practices actually look like as well. So cultural proficiency, ultimate level, right? You're going to talk about being able to add to the cultural competence knowledge base, right? You're doing some really good work and you're sharing it out. You're employing experts in cultural competence, that you're mentoring others who ask for this help, usually other libraries or the other librarians. You advocate for the underserved and you partner with others. And that's kind of when you hit that ultimate level. A lot of people argue this is actually cultural humility, which is kind of that upper echelon of what we're trying to do with the cultural competence work. And what cultural humility is this idea that you've made this lifelong commitment to being self-evaluative and critiquing and redressing the power imbalances that we actually find. Now, Tervalan and Murray Garcia were talking about this from the medical perspective, but we can swap out physician-patient with librarian-patron, right? Or even colleagues in this case. And this idea of creating something that's mutually beneficial and non-paternalistic, having partnerships, working with our communities and on behalf of the individuals that we actually have in our defined populations. And so Project Ready, which comes out of UNC, actually shows this as a pyramid. So creating the base is cultural competence. Cultural humility is at the top, right? So if you build a base of cultural competence, you can then move on to this idea of being able to hold the systems accountable, to be able to actually redress those power imbalances when you see them. So it's not just a case of something's wrong here, it's a case of something's wrong and we're going to fix it. And that's what cultural humility actually is when you hit that upper part of the pyramid as well. And so, did want to give you a check-in. I know I flew through the cultural competence timeline, the continuum, but I want to see where you think you are on the continuum and where you think your organization is right now, as of today. So head on over to slido.com for one last time. You can hear me just one more time. And let me know where you think you are. You should see something that says self and then organization. So you can choose two of those to see where you think you are and where your organization actually is on the continuum. And we'll see where you all feel. And I did put these in order of lowest to highest. Oh, getting a lot of cultural sensitivity, pre-competence for both. That's good to see. Yeah. I mean, you're still at a stage where there's work to be done, but that's a positive stage. We got some cultural competence for orgs. Glad to hear that from some of you. And hopefully you're also working in those if you feel you're at the cultural competence stage. We have a few organizations at the incapacity, probably a few organizations at the cultural blindness stage. Yeah, tends to happen quite a bit. But this is good. I'm actually glad to see quite a few of you feel like you're actually kind of in that midpoint, right? And you have some space to grow. I am glad to see we don't have a high number who feel like that our organization is in the cultural destructiveness phase. I'm glad to see that. So I did want to say, because people always ask me, what can individuals do to really help this process? And you've heard me say this before, I'm going to say it again, training. You can get training, you can take additional training. Self-education is really important, reading as much as you can. You're burned out, you're tired, but reading as much as you can. The self-reflection is also really important. If you're someone who used to have a diary or journal in the past, start doing that again, but focusing specifically on this idea of cultural competence. Make sure you're also self-evaluating your own work critically. You're thinking about the work you're doing, whether or not you're applying EDI to your work and being culturally competent in your work. And as much as you can, mentor and collaborate and partner with others who are trying to do the same work, trying to learn as well, but also be vocal and be persistent. You have to try to speak up when you feel safe to do so. I definitely recognize it's not always a safe situation. When you feel safe to do so, speak up and be persistent about speaking up as well. And for those of you who are leaders, or if you're in organizations, what can you tell your leaders to do? Please be open to change. Please challenge the status quo. Let's make sure we're being transparent when we make decisions and be inclusive in our decision-making processes. Support our efforts both in words and actions. So if you say you're going to do it, make sure you do it. And then also don't just talk about things. And then also focus on accountability. And it's a reminder that we all need to be held accountable for our actions in our organizations, and that everyone's also accountable for EDI work when we do the work, and try to have more forward-looking accountability rather than backwards-looking accountability, which means that we're not focused on blaming people. We recognize mistakes are made, are going to continue to be made, but that harm can come from that, and that we need to focus on making sure that we're looking forward and how to identify a lesson, make a change, create a system that's going to be safer for everyone, and prevent any of this recurrence of all this bad actions or bad behaviors that tend to happen in organizations. The goal is not just to punish people, right? This idea, I'm going to punish you, I'm going to fire you. The goal is that we learn and grow. And if you're doing a little bit more forward-looking accountability, you have better options for that as well. Thank you.